All right, so we got some new reporting here coming out of CNN, of all places, where they are essentially getting into an issue that I've been talking about basically since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is this idea that flooding the country with infinite sums of weapons without virtually any guardrails to determine where these weapons are ending up or which hands they are ending up in could potentially have some blowback effects down the line, not really even just for the United States, but more so for the domestic political situation within Ukraine itself, anticipating that there could potentially be some form of a diplomatic settlement down the line. So here from CNN, they say, what happens to weapons sent to Ukraine? The US doesn't really know. Okay, seems like that might be a little bit of a problem here, but understand before we get into the details of this is a conversation that, especially on the left, if you have any opinion on this whatsoever, people are going to try to portray you as either simping for NATO and simping for the United States, or simping for Vladimir Putin and supporting the invasion of Russia, which I don't think that's really a necessary track that you have to go down one way or another. There is a large gray area where you can simultaneously support Ukrainians having the right to defend themselves while also recognizing that there could be some potential problems from the way that we are just flooding this country with weapons that we really don't even know where they're going to be ending up. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a nuanced breakdown here, but just to get into some of the details, they say the U.S. has few ways to track the substantial supply of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and other weaponry it has sent across the border into Ukraine, sources tell CNN, a blind spot that's due in large part to the lack of U.S. boots on the ground in the country and the easy portability of many of the smaller systems now pouring across the border. So first off, this is kind of a trend that you see throughout this entire article, and I'll link it down below if you want to go read it in its entirety, but I can't really tell if they're trying to push the idea that the United States should send boots on the ground troops to Ukraine, but if that's the case, that's absolutely fucking insane, and we should not be doing that. That would definitely 100% lead to World War III, and doesn't really need to be said, but that's something we should probably try to avoid. Definitely wouldn't be better for the people of Ukraine or for the people of the world in general, but they continue saying that this is a conscious risk that the Biden administration is willing to take. And they say in the short term, the U.S. sees the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment to be vital to the Ukrainians' ability to hold off Moscow's invasion. And a senior defense official said Tuesday that it is certainly the largest recent supply to a partner country in a conflict, but the risk both current U.S. officials and defense analysts say is that in the long term, some of those weapons may wind up in the hands of other militaries and other militias that the U.S. did not intend to arm. So the first thing that jumps out in my mind is like groups like the Azov Battalion and other far-right militias that exist within Ukraine. Now, if you're asking, are we arming the Azov Battalion? Yes, we absolutely are arming the Azov Battalion, and it's kind of a difficult conversation to have, because if you say we definitely should not be arming Nazis, which is the position that I hold, if you say that we definitely should not be arming this group, well, they also simultaneously happen to be the group that is disproportionately holding up in cities like Mariupol down in the south here, which has been one of the key cities that Russia has been trying to take, and I mean, it seems like they're inevitably going to take it eventually. But the Azov Battalion and other far-right militias, which are coordinating and are an official part of the Ukrainian National Defense Forces, they have been doing a significant amount of the fighting in the Donbas region here to the east, and also in Mariupol down to the southeast, which is a major port city that's pretty important to this entire war. But this is where most of the fighting is going to be concentrated, as Russia has openly stated they're sort of shifting their priorities in this war after they failed to take Kyiv. They failed to take basically the entirety of Ukraine, and now they're going to be relegated more so to the eastern portion of the Donbas here and trying to make this land bridge connection down to Crimea. So that's where they're shifting their focus right now, and that's where disproportionately groups like the Azov Battalion have been fighting. So it's a complicated question, because you don't want to arm Nazis, but at the same time, if you weren't arming the Azov Battalion, in all likelihood a lot of these places would have already fallen already. So I'll leave that up to you guys what your opinion is on that specifically. I definitely do not think we should be arming the Azov Battalion. I think we should have much better guardrails in place right now to make sure that these weapons are not going to be ending up in the hands of some groups like that. But at the same time, as you recognize the problems with arming neo-Nazi battalions like the Azov group, at the same time as you recognize that, you also have to recognize that they're not the entirety of the Ukrainian security forces. They're not, they don't have a massive political influence right now in the domestic political situation within Ukraine. So it's definitely simply, not correct or accurate in any way, shape, or form to feed into Putin's propaganda about a denazification campaign against Ukraine. But you also have to simultaneously square that with the fact that, yeah, we are arming Azov Battalion and other far-right fascist coalitions right now. So that's just the reality on the ground. But they continue saying, because the U.S. military is not on the ground, again, subtly pushing this idea that we should be, the U.S. and NATO are heavily reliant on information provided by Ukraine's government. And they say privately, officials recognize that Ukraine has an incentive to give only information that will bolster their case for more aid, more arms, and more diplomatic assistance. That's pretty obvious, but they say, quote, it's a war. Everything they do and say publicly is designed to help them win the war. Every public statement is an information operation. Every interview, every Zelensky appearance, broadcast is an information operation, said another source familiar with Western intelligence. And he says it doesn't mean that they're wrong to do it in any way. So yeah, I mean, this is just the reality of a war. Of course, Zelensky is going to be going out there and doing everything that he can, including only giving partial information or maybe even misinformation in some cases in order to bolster what he perceives to be his chances at pushing back the Russian invasion. So, that's pretty much a given, but they get into some of the details of some of the actual weapons that are in question here. So they say the Biden administration and NATO countries say that they are providing weapons to Ukraine based on what Ukrainian forces say that they need, whether it's portable systems like the Javelin and Stinger missiles or the Slovakian S-300 air defense system that was sent over the last week. And they say last week the U.S. agreed to provide Kyiv with the types of high-power capabilities some Biden administration officials viewed as too much of an escalation risk a few short weeks ago, including 11 Mi-17 helicopters, 18 155mm howitzer cannons, and 300 more Switchblade drones, but much of that support hasn't come online, and the Switchblades are mobile, one-time use drones that would also likely be difficult to track after the fact. And this is just really amazing. They say, I couldn't tell you where they are in Ukraine and whether the Ukrainians are using them at this point. A senior defense official told reporters last week, they're not telling us every round of ammunition they're firing and who and at when. We may never know exactly the degree to which they're using the switchblades and other forms of these weapons, so really significantly in the dark here. But they continue saying, Jordan Cohen, a defense and foreign policy analyst at the Cato Institute, who focuses on arms sales, said the biggest danger surrounding the flood of weapons being funneled into Ukraine is what happens to them when the war ends or transitions into some kind of a protracted stalemate. So this is really what I've been thinking about when I think of what potential blowback effects could come down the line. So again, you have some of the fiercest fighters within the Ukrainian defense forces within groups like the Azov Battalion, and they've been fighting since 2014 in the Donbas region, which again is where the war is looking like it's going to be heavily centered around now, as Russia has been pushed back from the major city centers here. But this is where they've been fighting since 2014. So, is it reasonable to think that if Zelensky comes to some sort of a ceasefire agreement, maybe that involves, concessions made in the Donbas, maybe it means, recognizing the Luhansk and Donetsk regions as independent republics or whatever the fuck Putin was trying to call them. Maybe it's going to mean some really difficult concessions that nobody is going to be happy with, especially not the Azov fighters or other far-right fascist coalitions that are fighting right now. They're especially not going to be happy with any types of concessions whatsoever that are made. But at the end of the day, there's only two ways that this war is going to end. Number one is with the total annihilation of the entirety of Ukraine, flattening it to the ground, or number two is going to be via diplomatic discussions. And unfortunately, the reality of the situation is, I don't support Putin's invasion. I don't think any of this was justified. But at the end of the day, in order to end the war and prevent further suffering for the Ukrainian people, you are going to have to make some really difficult concessions. And so the question then becomes, as they're saying here, what happens when the war ends? What happens when Zelensky has to make some concessions that a lot of these far-right militias are not too happy with? What are they going to then do with that fact and with the weapons that we've now given them? I mean, they are more heavily armed now than they have been in their entire existence, and they've also brought, foreign legion fighters in to fight alongside them from other fascist coalitions around the world, and this has been a massive PR boom for the Azov Battalion and other fascist coalitions and militias within Ukraine, because they are being viewed right now as the liberators. They are being viewed as the ones who are, standing up against Russian aggression. So with that situation laid out, the question then becomes, what exactly are they going to be doing with these weapons once there is potentially some diplomatic settlement that's reached? But they continue saying such a risk is part of any consideration to send weapons overseas. And they say for decades, the U.S. sent arms into Afghanistan, again, touching on one of these historic precedents. First to arm the Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviet army, army, then to arm Afghan forces in their fight against the Taliban. And inevitably, some weapons ended up on the black market, including anti-aircraft Stinger missiles, the same kind that the US is now providing to Ukraine. And they say the United States famously scrambled to recover Stingers after the Soviet war in Afghanistan. It wasn't successful in finding all of them, and when the US itself invaded Afghanistan in 2001, some officials feared that they could be used by the Taliban against the United States, and other weapons have ended up arming US adversaries. Much of what the US left behind to Afghan forces became part of the Taliban arsenal after the collapse of the Afghan government and military. And they say the problem is also not unique to Afghanistan. Weapons sold to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates found their way into the hands of fighters linked to Al-Qaeda and Iran, and the risk of a similar scenario happening in Ukraine also exists, the defense official acknowledged. And in 2020, the Defense Department Inspector General released a report raising concerns about the end-use monitoring of weapons being sent to Ukraine. And they say, but given the nearly insatiable short-term needs of the Ukrainian forces for more arms and ammunition, the long-term risk of weapons ending up on the black market or in the wrong hands was deemed acceptable. So that's the calculation that they are making here. And they say this could be a problem 10 years down the line, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be something we're thinking about, said Cohen, the Cato analyst. Over 50 million rounds of ammunition. All that ammunition isn't just going to be used to fight Russians. Eventually, the ammunition is going to be misused, whether intentionally or not. So listen, this is what senior U.S. defense officials are now admitting. And again, this is not something that wasn't too predictable. I've been saying this since the beginning of the Russian invasion, because we do have, as you're pointing out there, historic precedent to see what happens when you funnel infinite sums of weapons and support to groups that have terrible opinions on things or terrible ideologies in the case of the Azov battalion. So, we understand the potential effects from blowback that could come diplomatically or, domestically within Ukraine if there is some potential diplomatic settlement that is reached in the future. I don't think that Azov battalion members or other far-right militias are going to be too happy with any concessions that are made. And so these are fair questions, right? On the one hand, you don't want to justify Putin's claims of denazification of Ukraine. Those are entirely bullshit. And if anything, him invading Ukraine has only bolstered the power of the Azov battalion, as we flooded them with weapons and they're getting all of this PR boost as a result of the invasion. So the justification based on denazifying Ukraine is entirely bullshit, but at the same time you have to recognize these problems and actually think about it more deeply and potentially think that maybe we should have some firm guardrails on here so we aren't arming these far-right fascist coalitions that could potentially produce some blowback consequences for the people of Ukraine.